What's up? This is Hoppe Hour. I am your host, Ryan Hoppe, and I am here hanging out with sports radio veteran and legend, Todd Wright. He is on Hoppe Hour. What's up, dude?
One of the best name podcasts out there. My compliments on the name, Ryan. My compliments on using your name to your advantage. And this coming from someone, yes, my real name is Wright. That is my actual real name. I didn't change it for TV radio purposes. But even I cannot match the authenticity for a podcast name as Hoppe Hour.
Now, you're very opinionated on radio overall. Do you hate nicknames?
They have a place.
Yeah.
They have a place. They should not dominate. Do you agree?
It should not be forced. It should come naturally.
I think I was more into nicknames when Shaq first started playing at LSU, and I think I overdid it, and then I backed off. And look, if there are people that they get excited about nicknames or whatever, perhaps it's part, I always say to people, I went to the University of Miami. I did not go to the U because they hadn't started using that term or putting their hands together when I was there. And I say the University of Miami won 5 titles. The U has won nothing. That might be part of it. So I get that people are into things like that, but I think you agree they can be overused and it becomes cliche.
Do you think when they went to being the U, it was sort of a sports jinx?
Well, it was a marketing plan. They paid a marketing group and they paid Michael Irvin to come back and do it. From that sense, Ryan, it worked. But the identity of that program hasn't followed on the field. If you're going to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk, and they haven't done that.
Over the last 9 to 10 years since 2010, what are some teams that you think were supposed to be huge in this decade, since this decade's ending, that just never really made it? Like some that were supposed to be huge and just kind of fizzled.
It's a good time, and we did not rehearse this, so you're hitting me with different things. Let me modify this for something I feel I can speak quickly about and spontaneously about.
Sounds good.
I always think there are names in sports that they raise expectations by what they do in the regular season, but you can count on them coming up short when it comes to the postseason. I've always felt that way about James Harden of the Houston Rockets, and that has played out. I felt that way for many years about Alex Ovechkin. But that year also, Ryan, I went out of my way to say, I think this Caps team is different. I think this Caps team, more than it being on Ovechkin, this team is built to win the Stanley Cup, and they did. And sadly, for local people in Tampa Bay, Ovechkin has been replaced, in my opinion, by Steven Stamkos with John Cooper, especially after the 4-game flop back in April when the Lightning went out to the Columbus Blue Jackets. I always felt that way about Marvin Lewis coaching the Cincinnati Bengals.
For way too long.
And I made plenty of money betting against Marvin Lewis's Bengals hosting, after winning the AFC North, a playoff game. No matter what, Marvin Lewis was not going to win a playoff game. He went either 0-6 or 0-7 as head coach of the Bengals. So Marvin Lewis replaced, in many people's minds, previously to that, it was Marty Schottenheimer, who couldn't win big. Some say that's still Andy Reid. He did get to 1 Super Bowl, lost, with last year's Chiefs at home to the Pats with the league MVP, lost. Some saddle Andy Reid with that term. So I think we've hit on 3 of the 4 major sports. I don't follow baseball, Ryan, as closely as I did growing up or for the first 40 years of my life, just because I think it's a dying sport.
It is.
So I can't give you a baseball example of that at this point, but I just gave you some, I think so. I think the University of Georgia football team is close to that they're not in the same conversation with Alabama and Clemson, even though they seem to be brought up as readily as, and Georgia is ready too. It's like, no, I want to see them actually beat one of these teams in the college football playoff before I'm going to predict Georgia will actually do it.
Now, how long have you been in the Tampa Bay area?
My grandparents, my legal guardians, brought me here right around the time, back when I loved baseball and the Big Red Machine, The Reds won the World Series in 75 and 76. So I have been here since then. So we're 4+ decades.
So you've been here since the beginning of the Rays. Has this area ever dug the Rays? Because I've been here 4 years, and I was looking at the playoffs last night and seeing who could make it in, and the Rays have a chance to make it in the wild card.
Oh, yeah.
And now I live maybe a half a mile from the Trop,
right?
And there is no hype in that whole neighborhood. So I want to ask you, why doesn't the Bay Area dig the Rays? What have they done wrong?
I don't think your podcast is long enough.
Yeah.
Now, on the field, granted, there were some horrible years with the Rays. From the beginning, I mean, it's still amazing to think what they were, and then suddenly they were in a position to go to the World Series. It was very impressive what they did to change the culture, to change their philosophy, to build that team. And for about 5 years under Friedman and Madden, they were an annual playoff contender, and many thought they could make another run at another World Series. Then it dropped off for another 6 years, and now they're back. They won 90 last year. They're going to win similar to that number or more this year, and likely be in a situation where they'll either be in the wild card game or they'll just miss the wild card game by a game or two. So as far as from that standpoint, there's nothing wrong. But in terms of everything else, I don't know where we start, Ryan. Where would you start? What's your observation after 4 years?
There's a vibe. I've been to 2 Rays games, and it's just not very friendly. It's not very warming. Like when you go to a Bolts game, you feel like you're at home. You feel like you're with friends, even if you haven't met people. Like you just hang out with random people. You give each other high fives when there's a goal, but there's no pride when you're at a Rays game. Nobody's like, oh my God, they just won. So I don't know.
Can I ask you something about the high five?
Yeah. That was just an example.
No. I hope you don't mind me doing this on your podcast.
It's all good.
So in the 6 years that I traveled from Tampa to Dallas for most of the Cowboy home games at the old Texas Stadium.
Yeah.
I had Kane season tickets for the Orange Bowl and Cowboy season tickets in Dallas. 2 great venues to watch big-time football games that no longer exist.
Yeah.
I just kind of decided somewhere in the early 2000s when I was going to these games that the high five was stupid.
I agree.
Now, kids can get away with anything. Damn them. So as a kid, I got away with it. You got away with it. Kids now, right? They can get away with pretty much anything. Older people, they get a free pass. I was raised by grandparents. Older people, right. They've earned the right. Wear what you want. Do what you want. You're older. We hope it doesn't affect us, but they've earned the right. They've been on this planet long enough. Ladies, you're ladies. Sure. If I'm in a situation with a woman and you can fill in the blank and she's happy with me and goes to high five me, I obviously did something right. She's going to get that kind of love. But if a fan near me who I don't know, who didn't even want to get out of their way to let me to my seat after coming back from the bathroom, after the Cowboys score a touchdown, turns to me and wants to high five me, why do I high five them? I don't get it, Ryan.
Does it feel forced?
Yes. It feels like fans have a need to do something to look around them. Ooh, who can I high five off something good that happened to my team? I don't get it.
I think what's worse is I went to a Dodgers game about 9 years ago, and the wave. There's nothing worse than the wave for me.
The wave's bad.
Yeah.
The wave's bad. I have a Trop story about the wave many years ago. You will appreciate. So the Indians came to town, and this is when the Indians were really the Indians. They're a good team now, but not like those Indian teams. I used to have John Hart on my national show, and I always asked John Hart, I said, John, you do realize I will only leave this job here at ESPN Radio to come work for you in the ticket office. And he laughs, and I said, because I have nothing to do. Yeah. Remember, the season was sold out before the season ever began. I joked with him, do you have ticket reps? Yes, we do. Well, what do they do all day? Because you have no tickets to sell. That's how special it was with those Indian teams in the 90s. So it was back when they had what? Was it Manny hitting in front of Thome or Thome hitting in front of Manny? Which was it?
Probably Thome.
Thome hitting in front of Manny. All right. So the Indians are already up, I don't know, 4-0, 5-0 in a game in like the third inning. I'm sitting in the back of a section down the right field line behind first base, and you've got that guy who's trying to start the wave, about 7 rows in front of me, surrounded by a lot of empty seats, and he just keeps trying to start the wave. So so Manny was batting, and Manny gets walked. So the guy keeps trying to do the wave, or no, I think Manny had like an RBI single, knocked in a couple of runs. Indians still have a couple runners on, and he's like, well, I'm not going to let that stop me. Come on, we got to get the wave going. And I remember saying in my head, Jim Thome, can you do something to sit this guy down for good? And the very next pitch, in a classic Jim Thome perfect swing, he laid one on a line that hit the Batter's Eye restaurant in center field. And that guy never got up again. I told Jim Thome that story about a month later, and he's like, happy to help.
Jim Thome, I never met him, but he just seems like the classiest of classy guys.
And he's on the $20 bill. No, he actually said to me that he thought it was Peter Gammons on the $20 bill. And is it sad? I mean, maybe this is part of the disconnect with baseball, Ryan. You and I more freely, Ryan, you're how old? Do you mind me asking?
26.
You? Okay. But you can more freely talk about those days in baseball where you could freely name the star players, whether you liked them or not. People can't do that anymore.
It's Bryce Harper and Mike Trout. Even then.
Yeah. I mean, I think other than in Los Angeles, in many baseball cities, Clayton Kershaw can walk into a restaurant and nobody knows who he is. How many of the Houston Astros, the best team in baseball going right now on an every year basis, in other cities, if they're not together, could walk into a bar or a restaurant and people don't know they're the Houston Astros?
5 years ago, I went to a Dodgers-Cubs game at Wrigley Field with my uncle, and all the Dodgers walked out. Yasiel Puig, Clayton Kershaw, a few others that I can't name, obviously. And besides maybe 20 Dodger fans that were visiting, there was a part where they were walking like 25 feet to the bus, and it was like they were any average Joe.
So maybe let me bring this back to the Rays. And I'm not saying because the Rays have a formula and a three-headed monster. I think Kevin Cash is one of the more underappreciated sports personalities in the Tampa Bay market for the job that he has done. Considering the walking orders, what he has to do, and how he manages the room. So maybe we've identified what part of the problem is. Because I, Ryan, can right now run down for you the big red machine very easily. Tony Perez at first, then he left to go free agent, Dan Dreesen. Joe Morgan at second. Concepcion at short, Pete Rose at third. George Foster in left. Cesar Geronimo, center field. Ken Griffey, there was no junior. Ken Griffey in right field. And my favorite of all time, Johnny Bench behind the plate. All right? That's what baseball was to people back then. Can people do that with the Rays? Because they mix and match players so much. And granted, it wins games. But can people really identify with players? Even on a big-time team that has money like the Yankees and Red Sox, they change so fast. There's none of that anymore in baseball where you know who's playing every position every day and it lasts for years.
You know what's weird, too, is I'm from up north, so whenever the Cubs or Sox would be on the radio, there was like an interest to listen to it. But I don't feel that way about Tampa. Like whenever the game's on the radio, I immediately change. I'm like, it's just not fun to listen to anymore either.
And it's a shame because the announcers do a good job. It's the toughest, in my opinion. I have done baseball on the radio. I've done virtually every sport, either on the radio or on television. Baseball, you have to fill time because the game is slow. You have to fill that. You have to be you have to be interesting. Dare I say, it's like doing a 3 to 4 hour talk show.
Yeah.
While an actual event is taking place.
I can't imagine like during the downtime when there's a commercial break or there's a bunch of pop-ups, like I can't imagine having to fill time, because at least with a talk show, you can take a break or you can go to your co-host that can help out. But I can't imagine when the game's like 14-0 and let's say the Padres are just getting blown out, like what you would talk about if you're a Padres announcer.
Well, that is why back then, and most of them are no longer with us, and Marty Brenneman, the longtime voice of the Reds, this is his last season. And Marty gave me one of the best compliments ever. When I was starting out in sports radio on the original Sports Radio 910 in Tampa Bay, which was a signal out of Plant City, Florida. It was a horrible signal for the Tampa Bay area, but people remember Sports Radio 910, and I remember a few years later actually getting the chance to talk to Marty Brenneman because I was now working on ESPN and national radio. And Marty said, Todd, I'm very familiar with you. Says, I used to listen to your show when the Reds were training in Plant City. And I said, you did? He's like, yeah. He said, I listened on my drive to the ballpark for the 1 o'clock games when the Reds trained in Plant City. And it's little things like that, Ryan, and I'm sure you're going to experience this as well when you find out certain people that listen to your podcast, just the fact that they give of their time and their ears to listen to you because of what you think of them. It's very meaningful, and it keeps people like you doing what you do. I'm retired, but it keeps me doing things like this with you and doing all of my podcasts that I'd love to promote with you, by the way, because it's just that little bit that what we're doing does matter to some people, and there are some people out there, you have no idea who's listening. It can be a bad thing, but it can also be a very good, humbling thing.
So even though you're not on the radio, where can people find everything you're up to? The life and times of Todd Wright.
It's a good life. Again, when you work 17 and a half years in national radio and you're single your entire life, no wife, no kids, no pets, no plants that need water, and you got a hell of a deal on a condo and owe no money on it, I'm well set. So all I do now is play golf, run golf tournaments, make television and radio appearances, and I do 4 podcasts. They're all seasonal. There's a Lightning playoff podcast. Obviously, that was short this last season.
Yeah.
There is the Todd Wright Fantasy Football podcast. That's been 4 seasons running. And Ryan, the trend, unfortunately, in the fantasy sports universe is that most want to charge for fantasy content. That's been the trend. I will not do that to people. Not only will my podcast always be free, because I know how to sell advertising. Thank you to Hooters and Bill Curry Ford. But I also will respond to everyone's fantasy football related email at toddwrightfantasyfootball@gmail.com. Don't tweet me. Write me an email. Ask me a question, fantasy related. I will answer it. I've answered every email, Ryan, for 3 years. Every single email. I don't know anyone else in the fantasy universe who does that. I do it all for free. Then there's the Todd Wright Toddcast, which is basically everything not fantasy related. A lot of football this time of year, but there are other sports and other things I talk about. And then there's a specific Bucks Bulletin, Todd Wright Fantasy Football podcast that is a fantasy exclusive breakdown of the matchup each week between the Bucks and their opponent that no one else does. So those are all my podcasts, and I encourage your Hoppe Hour listeners to follow me on Facebook. I'm simply Todd Wright in Tampa, Florida, or on Instagram at Todd Wright 2019.
Well, dude, it's been a lot of fun having you on the show, and I can't wait to see you keep going on Mike O's show and Drew's show. It's a lot of fun hearing you when you're on the bone talking to the guys.
You guys keep me sharp. If it wasn't for you, and it wasn't for Mike, and it wasn't for Bone Fantasy Live and Drew Garabo Live and Bay News 9, I wouldn't be as sharp on the podcast. So thank you, Ryan. I appreciate you having me on. I'll be happy to do it again anytime.
Awesome. Thank you, dude.